I have 20 minutes to tell you that apartheid is real. And I'm told to speak very slow. First, I apologize. There's no protest, so sorry to the youth. I was hoping to speak from a balcony with a megaphone to the angry masses and, start a rebellion. Fortunately, we didn't have to go there. We learned that some speech is freer than others in post-Charlie France. No, but you should give yourselves a round of applause because it was because of your pressure and your outrage and your action that we are actually in this room right now and not out in the cold, and that is an achievement for this movement, so you should feel free to give yourselves a round of applause. Or you can wait for the translation of what I just said. So, 2 days ago, Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, declared that he will never cede land to the Palestinians ever. He said this over and over again, but finally the media is paying attention. And Netanyahu is likely to be the next prime minister. He's saying there will never be two states, and he's right. I see no possibility for a sovereign Palestinian state in my lifetime, and I don't know where Israel is. And I will offer anyone in this room 100 euros if you can bring me a piece of paper and accurately draw Israel on it, because you can't do it. Israel has no internationally recognized borders. They're constantly growing. So we are in a one-state reality, and that's where this entire conversation flows from, and that is why BDS is necessary. Everyone is living under a single regime from the river to the sea, and it is the regime of the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant, or JSIL. Jash instead of dash. Rights flow from ethnicity and religion in JSIL. And religion is racialized. Everyone receives their rights based on who they are. And I, as an American Jew with no Israeli citizenship, have more rights in the land of Israel, Palestine, than Bilal or any Palestinian on earth, and it's simply because I have J-positive blood. There are 5 matrices of control that govern the lives of Palestinians, and each Palestinian is fits into one of these 5 designs. The first was described to you by Bilal. It's the matrix of control that governs the West Bank, which is the Israeli military occupation, overseen by the Orwellian-named Civil Administration Authority. It's actually a military administration. It oversees the courts, which impose administrative detention on Palestinian prisoners. They can be detained without charges. They are put on trial in a military kangaroo court in the Ofer military prison, where there was a 99.97% conviction rate. There is a special children's court, and I have personally witnessed multiple children as young as 14 years old put on trial for stone throwing. They're arrested at night, and they're often held for months without charges. They live in one of the either Area C or B, which are full or partial Israeli military control. Area A, the main Palestinian population clusters like Bethlehem, are controlled supposedly by the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority is simply the native arm of the Israeli military and exists as a contractor of the occupation to arrest, control, and dominate Palestinians on behalf of Israel. Palestinians in the West Bank have no legal rights, no property rights, no human rights. In fact, it is illegal to gather in a group larger than 12, which is why you see demonstrations fired upon and broken up, with everything ranging from rubber-coated steel bullets to the chemical known as skunk, to tear gas, and now to live fire under Israel's new unspoken policy of shoot to cripple, where live bullets are fired at the knees and the abdomens of protesters, which is why we're seeing increasing number of casualties in the West Bank, higher than at any time since the Second Intifada. Apartheid is real in Jerusalem, the second matrix of control. East Jerusalem, which was supposed to be the future capital of a Palestinian state, is occupied territory under international law, and no Israeli government has any intention of ever allowing it to be controlled by Palestinians. That's why they refer to an eternal undivided Jerusalem. And that means that the 300,000 Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem, who have Jordanian residency, are controlled by a heavily militarized Israeli police force. And they are governed by apartheid policies. One of the most ironic policies that's been applied to this population are home evictions, in which Jewish settlers who claim that they can prove that their families lived in Palestinian homes prior to 1948 can take over those homes, and the families will be thrown out with just 15 minutes notice in the middle of the night. We saw that in Sheikh Jarrah, we see it in Beit Hanina, we're seeing it especially in Silwan. And this is a complete reversal of the law that's applied to Palestinians, where if they lived there before 1948 and they left, they're refugees and they can never return. So the right of return applies to Jews only, and there is actually the first law that the State of Israel ever passed, the law of return, which it gives me the right to return to a place that my family supposedly lived in 3,000 years ago. You know, and because I have like the pager number of Maimonides, and I can like hit up Moses on my cell phone. Like, I have any connection to these people. My family's from the Ukraine and Russia, and you know, this is ridiculous. But if you say otherwise, you're an anti-Semite, because I'm a Semite and you're not. Can I just add another policy in Jerusalem that is essential to understand is the center of life policy. And this is how Jerusalem is depopulated. Palestinians in East Jerusalem have to constantly prove that they live there, prove to the Jerusalem municipality. That means they have to constantly show that they pay their bills, they have to show paperwork. If they have a child there, the birth has to be recorded in Jerusalem, or the child doesn't exist. For example, if the child's born in the West Bank, the child has nothing, no papers. And so for those Palestinians in Jerusalem who maybe go to Birzeit University in the West Bank and meet a partner there and get married, and that partner has a Huwiyah, Palestinian Authority papers, and lives in the West Bank, there's only one place the two of them can live without the Jerusalem Palestinian losing their residency. And it's Kufr Aqab, which is basically a refugee camp for lovers. It exists on the other side of the separation wall, so it's separated from Jerusalem by a wall, but it's technically part of the Jerusalem municipality, so you're still in Jerusalem. What does that mean for these couples? It means that they're living in an area with no public services, but they're paying close to 1,000 shekels a month, which is like, I don't know, 200 some euros in taxes. They have no trash pickup, so there's just trash everywhere. No street repairs, so the streets are just filled with potholes. No police, so people have to police themselves. No street lights. No fire department, because the Palestinian Authority fire crews are not allowed to enter, and the Jerusalem fire crews can't pass through the walls. So that isn't apartheid, I don't know what apartheid is. And actually, this is interesting because I said how Palestinians in East Jerusalem have to constantly prove their presence. Jews in West Jerusalem and even Jews in East Jerusalem, many of them live somewhere else. They're wealthy Jews from the US and from France who own property there and never have to prove their presence. I found this magazine of the Jewish community in France, or some part of it, in the memorial outside the kosher supermarket, and it's pushing Aliyah, or mass immigration, to Israel. The Israeli government has an ad on the back, so they want to clear France of its Jewish population. And they're advertising on the inside residences in East Talpiot, which is an illegal settlement in East Jerusalem, where no one has to prove their residency. Many of these towers are actually referred to as ghost towers because they're empty during the winter when Jews from the diaspora are back home working. And Bilal, you're not allowed to live there. Sorry.
Even it's my village.
Yeah. So the most complicated part of this discussion is when you bring up Israel proper, or those who are governed by Israeli civil law, because supporters of Israel will say, well, our Arabs, we're so nice to our Arabs, we let them vote. We have democracy. It's not apartheid. They have parties, and our Arabs are happy. Crumbs from the master's table, they get lots of them. But if you actually look at the laws, there are over 50 discriminatory laws, according to Adalah, the Center for the Legal Rights of the Arab Minority in Israel. And they're constantly putting new laws on the books that make it more and more clear what this system is about. For example, the Acceptance to Community Law, which was passed in 2011, authorizes communities of under 500 to discriminate on the basis of race and religion, meaning Jews-only communities are authorized. But Israel has always had these kinds of laws. They were just less explicit. For example, the Jewish National Fund law, passed in 1964, authorizes or guarantees that the Jewish National Fund has 7 out of 13 seats on the board of the Israel Lands Administration. It's starting to sound Byzantine and complex. The Israel Lands Administration controls all public land in Israel, which is basically all land. The Jewish National Fund only technically controls 20%. But through controlling these seats, it really controls all land. And on its website, the Jewish National Fund says its mission is to provide land to the Jewish people. So it is a Jews-only landlord that controls all of the land that's leased in Israel, which is why it's impossible for Arab communities to expand according to their natural growth. And beyond that, the Jewish National Fund has a design in the Negev desert where over 100,000 Bedouin citizens of Israel live. 80,000 live in unrecognized communities. They can't be recognized because their residents aren't Jewish. And if they're not recognized, they can't receive public services. All construction is considered illegal, can be demolished at any time. And the Jewish National Fund has a plan called the Prawer Plan, which is temporarily suspended, Prawer, to remove 60,000 indigenous Bedouins, citizens of Israel, and place them in townships built by the state, which are the only Arab towns the state of Israel has ever built in its history, which are designed to concentrate the Bedouin population, and replace those towns with Jews-only communities. One town which has resisted, Al-Araqib, has had its structures demolished 82 times since 2010. 82 times. And the families are now living in the cemetery. The Jewish National Fund is planning to build a Jews-only community on top of their town. And the Jewish National Fund is a non-profit in the United States and in Canada and in France. It's committing these acts of terror against an indigenous population, and no one is trying to shut it down like they shut down Muslim charities who are simply sending aid to Gaza. So this is merely one small aspect of apartheid inside Israel proper. And because I have limited time, I can't go further on that, on Israel, but we'll move to another area after this brief translation. The fourth matrix of control exists in the Gaza Strip. When Israel enacted its disengagement with the Gaza Strip beginning in 2005, it declared that it had no responsibility for the population of the Gaza Strip under the Geneva Conventions and international law, and that the Gaza Strip was no longer occupied, but it simply employed the panopticon system of occupation, which is to govern a population as prisoners are governed. To effectively administer a prison, you only need to control 1% of the prison according to the panopticon theory, and that is the perimeter of the prison. And so Gaza is controlled through a naval blockade, which prevents fishermen from going more than 3 to about 4.5 miles at sea in reality. From the east, it is completely encircled with concrete walls and electrified fences, which are covered with remote-controlled machine guns. Anyone who enters the 300-meter buffer zone, which is some of the only farming land in the Gaza Strip, can be shot. Many can be shot by remote control. Since yesterday was International Women's Day, the Israeli army celebrated its female soldiers. Those who control the ceasefire guns, that's what they're called, do so in an office far away in the Negev desert. They are all female soldiers, and the joysticks are smaller for female hands. That was reported in Haaretz. So all goods in the Gaza Strip, everything that goes in and out, is controlled either by Israel or the Zionist government of Egypt and General Fattah el-Sisi and his military junta. The border, since the war, the border of Rafah in Egypt has only been open for 3 days. So people are basically trapped in Gaza. Gaza is constantly patrolled by Israeli drones at all times. Neighborhoods are filled with collaborators who are manipulated by the Israeli security service. It is the most heavily surveilled piece of earth on the planet. The Israeli military administration, which governs the Gaza Strip, has used complex mathematical formulas to determine how many calories each resident should receive. They have determined that each resident of the Gaza Strip should receive 2,249 calories per day, which is just above famine level, but not a substantial amount of calories. The former Israeli government advisor, Dov Weissglass, said, "We won't allow them to starve, we'll just put them on a diet." And so goods are limited to the Gaza Strip, but goods are available. All of these goods are Israeli goods, almost all of them, when you go into a market in Gaza, which makes BDS almost impossible. And there's a logic to this. Gaza is a literally captive market for the Israeli economy. The Gaza Strip and the West Bank, the occupied territories, are the #2 export market for Israel. So Israel incentivizes occupation. One more point. Weapons are tested on the population of the Gaza Strip that cannot be tested elsewhere, as well as new methods of surveillance, and then they are exported as field tested. So between Operation Cast Lead, which ended in early 2009, and Operation Pillar of Defense in November 2012, Israel increased its military exports by $1 billion by testing new weapons on Palestinians. Therefore, it proves that occupation is profitable. And let me make one quick other point on apartheid in Gaza, because we're making an analogy to South African apartheid. And South African apartheid was an abominable system. But this is apartheid on steroids. This is arguably worse than South African apartheid, because the apartheid government never bombed its Bantustans with 2,000 and 5,000 pound missiles, and the South African apartheid government needed black labor. They needed to exploit black labor. Israel does not need Palestinians. They are warehousing Palestinians permanently in the Gaza Strip as surplus people. It's a warehouse for the non-Charlies. And it's because they're not Jewish. If they were Jewish, the walls would come down tomorrow. And the final matrix of control is one of exclusion and removal. And that is what governs the Palestinian refugees, those who were removed from their homes between September 1947 and the cessation of hostilities of the 1948 war, sometime in late 1948, and thereafter. There were many, many removals in the years afterwards. Israel passed a law called the Prevention of Infiltration Act in 1951, I believe. This was way before the occupation began, 16 years before the occupation, and this law declared that anyone who had left their homes in that period was not a refugee. Therefore, Resolution 194 of the United Nations, which authorizes the right of return for refugees, and the International Conventions on Refugees, all international law which had been passed was nullified. These refugees were declared infiltrators, as if they had had no home in Palestine before. And if they ever set foot within Israeli-controlled territory, they could be forcibly removed. And they have been ever since Israel was established. I mean, we're talking about 750,000 people and their descendants. There are now something like 7 million Palestinian refugees in the world. None can enter. We saw what happened on May 15th, Nakba Day 2011, when refugees from Lebanon attempted to march to their ancestral homeland and were shot with live fire by Israeli soldiers. Over 20 were killed. This was a nonviolent demonstration, the kind that Western liberals always ask Palestinians to embark on. But when they get shot, there's no solidarity for them. The Prevention of Infiltration Act was recently updated. It was updated in 2012 to apply to the 60,000 non-Jewish African asylum seekers who live inside Israel, who have been denied work permits and denied the ability to find housing. Many of them sleep out in the open in Tel Aviv and are victims of regular racist hate crimes. Under this law, the state can detain any African asylum seeker without any suspicion that they've committed a crime and imprison them for 3 years without charges. And so thousands have been rounded up in the streets, first identified as being black, the crime of blackness, taken to a camp in the desert, either Holot or Saharonim, and they are being warehoused there without charges simply for not being Jewish. So the entire system of apartheid applies to anyone who is not Jewish. We have to recognize that the greatest threat to Israel is not rockets from Hamas or rockets from Hezbollah. It is democracy. And when you are accused of wanting to destroy Israel, it's because you want to democratize Israel-Palestine, which will actually improve the lives of everyone who's living there. There's enough room for everyone in Israel-Palestine, including African asylum seekers fleeing genocide in Darfur. And so we just need to simply make it so. And the only tactic available to us, which you're going to speak about now, is BDS.